To be an atheist, you need to have a fairly good grasp of theism. You need to know what it is you're actually rejecting, otherwise you risk rendering your position null and void from the outset. But there's reason to believe that a great deal of atheists, especially new atheists who are particularly popular in the past decade, individuals like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens, are somewhat lacking in this respect, somewhat lacking in their ability to understand the essence of theism. I'll try to highlight these shortcomings by assessing two fairly popular arguments used by atheists. And with these arguments, hopefully I can demonstrate the most fundamental, or what I take to be the most fundamental misunderstanding on the part of new atheists. It is unfortunately a misunderstanding that clouds the debates between atheists and apologists, and usually means they don't actually get at the core issue of, well, God. The first of these two arguments is modern theists happen to believe in one God, but in so doing they deny the existence of many others that have existed throughout the history of religion. They're therefore atheists when it comes to Zeus, Ra, Thor, Ishtar, Hera and the like, all the others that pagans used to believe in various civilizations and various epochs in human history. So why is it that they object the idea of the modern atheist rejecting just one more God, which is of course the Christian or the Jewish or the Islamic or whatever else it may be? The second argument, which popular atheists are very fond of, is if God is said to have created everything and everything requires a creative cause, well, who created God? If everything that exists has a cause, why, in particular, does God have the special privilege which allows him to get away with being uncaused? This seems like an arbitrary designation in the eyes of skeptics. What's so interesting about these two arguments isn't that they're very good. Without wishing to be rude, they're not very good at all. It's that they can become good arguments if the type of theism that theists believe in and theists hold is itself of bad quality. So they're arguments that work well to attack bad theology, but when they come up against any sort of semi-respectable theology, they tend to fall apart. Crucially, both of the arguments assume that God, as articulated in and believed by any major theistic faith nowadays, is, to use a very important phrase, just a being amongst beings. That is, if your conception of God is that he's nothing more than a man in the sky, as is the common atheist caricature, sort of floating somewhere up there in the ether, looking down and deliberating, stroking his beard, then very weak atheistic arguments, just like the two I've articulated, become very appealing. Bad theology gives way to bad atheism. And on that level, they both continue to argue, sort of ignoring the essence of the issue. The reason that I don't hold these arguments in very high esteem is because they don't quite understand what theology claims God to be. They're the kind of arguments you could only really make in ignorance of the great philosophers of any major theistic tradition, when you only engage a modern, essentially deistic conception of God. Deism is a metaphysics that was very popular and had its origin in the Enlightenment, and figures as famous as Voltaire counted themselves amongst them. It was essentially and primarily a response to Newtonian physics. God of the classical tradition was enucleated of his immanence to creation and thought to be nothing but a primordial entity at the start of the causal chain who sort of flicks the first domino and allows the mechanistic clockwork of Newton's universe to tick on, one cause after another, one atom bumping into the other. And crucially, of course, these atoms and these causes within creation would tick on in a self-sufficient manner without needing God anymore. God was just the first thing in the causal chain that allowed everything to carry on. It's very important to understand that this is a modern metaphysics. As I said, it comes about with the Enlightenment in the 17th century, the 1600s. And it's not one native to the traditions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, for example. Whenever we think God is just a being amongst beings, and that is still the crucial phrase, of course, a being who exists in the same way that a book exists, or a black hole, or an atom, or even an angel, we categorically misunderstand the claims of classical theology. Now, it's normal for us modern people to miss this important distinction because nowadays we conflate it with the distinction between the natural and the supernatural. Because we all tend nowadays not to believe in things like angels and demons and are all at the least implicitly materialistic in the way we live our lives, wherever we hear religions talking about the supernatural, broadly speaking, we sort of make our division along those lines and put the natural in one camp and the supernatural in the other, and here's the kicker, group all of this together in one division, one univocal singular category. And there you lose the important distinction between God and creatures because, you just think, well, an angel is a supernatural being and God's a supernatural being. They're just over there, and either we believe in them with faith or we don't believe in them, but we have the empirical world, or the world that we can know empirically through science in its natural form. Again, this is a modern distinction, and one that we need to take stock of and need to be aware is not applicable at all to the classical metaphysics on which major religions are founded. Our big mistake is taking God with a capital G and putting him in the same category as multiple gods with lowercase g. But no one in the classical world, which is where, and to speak specifically of Christianity, where Christianity gets its foundational ideas about theism from, ever thought in those terms. For them, the cosmos was brimming with angels and demons and sometimes even gods with a lowercase g. But very importantly, God with a capital G was not within this cosmos. That God was thought to be absolute, unconditioned, infinite reality, without which nothing in that cosmos, including those supernatural beings, just as much as all natural beings, could possibly exist. This is why the first argument for atheism is one that simply doesn't apply to proper theism. We can either believe or disbelieve in particular supernatural entities, and indeed the reason we tend not to nowadays is because we have scientific explanations for things like, thunder or the harvest that previously we just explained through divine providence. But no matter of scientific advancement in this respect is ever going to pertain to capital G God, because God pertains to, and indeed is, the being of all that is. And you simply can't analyse that in scientific terms, which is why new atheism is so impoverished in this first respect. All it has is a scientific apparatus for investigation. The second argument can be dismissed by a change of the metaphorical way in which we conceptualise the relationship between God and creation. The image we might have in our heads is one of God, and again, think of deism here, flicking the first domino in the great causal chain. That is, he's floating out there in the void before the creation of the universe, and then through his causal intervention, the universe comes to exist. But there are problems that immediately arise from this. What would it mean to say that God is somehow before the origin of the universe if we believe that God is transcendent of time itself? How could God be before anything without being implicated in the causal chain of existence? If God is just a thing within the causal chain, that is, he's effectively still a domino, even if it's claimed he's the very first one, the domino that fell on its own, there's no way that we can actually justify the claim that he isn't caused himself. All we're doing is very subtly shifting the metaphorical language by saying that, well, he's not a domino, he's like the one who flicks the domino. But as long as we just have him at the start, at some particular point, an origin point, he's still implicated within that order, and we're just mixing metaphors to try and get away from the fact that, yes, that argument sticks if we don't clarify a definition of God well. If we just think he's the first being in a long chain of causal relationships, then the question of who created God is very much a valid one. It's simply not possible to claim that something is uncaused within the causal chain. Instead, we need to clarify that God is not a link in the chain, even if the very first, but he is the being of the causal chain itself. He is that which allows any of the links to link to each other, but something that's never implicated in the links themselves, never affected by their causal relationships. They would not exist without him. He is perfectly independent of them. If this is giving you a bit of a headache, perhaps it can be better understood with the change of metaphors, as I say, away from the domino idea and towards something a bit more sophisticated. Classical philosophers were very fond of the metaphor of light when trying to understand the relationship between creator and creation. Just as the light source and the light it emits are not really separate things in the way that the domino and the man who flicks the domino are, so too God and creation are linked in a way which means that the latter, that is creation, can't exist on its own terms. Unlike deism, which claims that if God ceased to exist after he flicked the first domino, the universe could simply just barrel on in its causal sequence like a car that would just keep driving if you plucked the driver out of the seat, it would be absurd to suggest that candlelight could continue to be emitted if you suddenly snuffed out the candle. The same goes for light from a lamp if you suddenly switched it off, or light from the sun if it suddenly became covered up in an eclipse, or it sunk down beneath the horizon for nighttime. This is exactly what Plato was talking about when he describes the good as the sun in his analogy, or one of his many analogies in the Republic. The sun isn't itself one of the many things that you can see, but it's the only thing that gives light to everything you can see. It's not a thing you can grasp or indeed look at directly without hurting yourself, but without it you wouldn't be able to see at all. It is not an object within your vision, but it is what allows for vision itself. Many other great minds of classical theism employed similar images, from Gregory of Nyssa to Ibn Arabi. One of my favourite contemporary theologians, David Bentley Hart, gives a fantastic example in his book The Experience of God, where he says, and I'm paraphrasing him here, God is like an author in relation to a book. You can scour the book itself looking for the physical person of the author, but of course you'll never find it. If you look through the whole of Bleak House looking for the person of Charles Dickens, you're not going to find him, even if, and pay attention, you go right to the very start, to the very beginning of the book, or you go right to the very end. You can, in fact, scour the book exhaustively, know everything about its printing, about the particular literary devices he uses in the metaphor, and know all the language exhaustively. Every single describable scientific fact about that book can be ascertained, and still you would have no evidence that Charles Dickens is there, because he's not a thing in that causal fold. So you might be inclined, if you were a slightly hasty atheist, as I fear many of the new atheists are, to claim as a result of not finding Charles Dickens in that book that Charles Dickens doesn't exist. But of course we know from the analogy that that's the most absurd conclusion that you could possibly come to. How could it ever be the case that, having analysed the book of Bleak House, you could say that the author does not exist or never has existed, because he is not there in the causal manifold? But it is precisely the thing that new atheists are arguing when they make the case that they do with these two arguments. They are assuming that God is a being amongst beings, that he is something to be found within the world. And because they don't find evidence of that being, of that hypothesis which they've arbitrarily set out for themselves, they conclude that God does not exist. I will expand on this conception of God in other videos. Plenty more to make. But given the focus here is just on atheism in particular, I thought I'd just narrow in a little and concentrate on Richard Dawkins' rather infamous reading of Thomas Aquinas in the God delusion. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Thomas Aquinas had what in Latin are called quinque viae, 5 ways, which were supposed to be sort of a propedeutic into philosophy regarding God and philosophical theism. They've sort of been misunderstood as comprehensive statements on why God definitely exists. They were never that for Aquinas. That's very important to understand. And Dawkins misunderstands this, of course, from the outset. There's much that he misunderstands. I'll just focus on Dawkins' response to the first 3 of Aquinas' ways, continuing the critiques I've made of the previous 2 atheistic arguments. The first way is the argument from motion. Motion clearly exists in the world. Motion is the transition of something from potentiality to actuality. Something cannot be potential and actual at the same time. Therefore, whatever is an emotion must be set off by something else. To avoid an infinite regress, we must have a prime mover. The second way is the argument from efficient causality. Efficient causality exists in the world. Nothing can be its own efficient cause. Therefore, all efficient causes must be caused by something else. To avoid an infinite regress, we must have a first cause. The third way is the argument from contingency. Contingency exists in the world. Contingency is the state of something not being necessary. Contingency cannot give rise to itself. Therefore, necessary being must exist. To avoid an infinite regress, there must be self-caused necessary being. Dawkins says that the first 3 of these ways rely upon, and I'm quoting him here, rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. Given what we've said, this is obviously incorrect. It's not unwarranted at all to say that God is immune to the regress. In fact, it's the most plainly obvious fact that you could even derive from it, just as the existence of Charles Dickens as an author is the most plainly obvious fact that you can derive from the existence of the book of Bleak House. But the only reason, of course, that you would forget to make that very obvious observation is if you've narrowed your focus just on the ambit of scientific discovery. That is, you've just gone, let's find out what's in this book and examine exhaustively all its elements whilst ignoring and foreclosing all those metaphysical underpinnings which allow the book to exist in the first place. Metaphysical meaning beyond the physical, in the case of this analogy, beyond the book itself. Dickens is obviously beyond the book itself, and yet the book would not exist without him. But that's not something you can find in the particular elements of the book. In the same way, Dawkins is only capable of thinking within the causal chain because, he's a scientist, and that's what scientists do very, very well, but it's also why scientists shouldn't do metaphysics if they're applying the same methodology. Dawkins has arbitrarily decided at the outset that God must be something that either belongs or doesn't belong within that causal chain. I can't think of the possibility of his transcending it. Aquinas isn't making the claim that because of movement, causality, and contingency, there must be one being at the start which kicks off the whole chain. In fact, Aquinas, and again I fear that Dawkins hasn't actually done his homework to read more than just a page of Aquinas, elsewhere makes clear that we actually can't prove that the universe did or did not have a beginning, and he chides other Christians, like Bonaventure, for saying that we definitely can come to a conclusion in that respect, because he says it's just bad reasoning. Aquinas is saying instead that we can see that everything in the universe, in the cosmos, in creation, to be more metaphysically precise, is subject to movement, which, of course, let's not forget, is like change in his terms, causality and contingency. And as a result, there must be being, capital B, that is not like these in order for the chain to exist in the first place. What I'm trying to get you to do is just sort of take a step back in order to see something that's so obvious. I'll reprise this analogy in a later video, but it is like trying to find your contact lenses when you've been wearing them the whole time. It's the most obvious truth. But of course, if you're looking around your bedroom, going, where are my contact lenses? You're not going to find them. All you need to do is realize, there's actually nothing that exists except through the vision of my contact lenses. Indeed, in a very real sense, the only thing that I am seeing right now are my contact lenses. The many beings within the spectrum of existent reality must have a spectrum in which to exist. This is the unconditioned ground of being, which allows all beings, with a lowercase b, to be. Again, the crucial point is, Dawkins thinks God is just king of the world, just a principle at the pinnacle of existence, rather than existence itself. So, to conclude, in all of these, it should be understood that Dawkins misunderstands the arguments because he falls into the same misapprehensions which practically all contemporary atheism suffers from. I'll reiterate the mantra, and it's very important you don't forget. God is not a being amongst beings. He is being itself. When this simple fact is grasped, the essence of new atheism tends to come undone, and a maturer, more sophisticated conception of theology and religion is understood.